Welcome into another episode of Discard for Magic. I'm one of your hosts, Aaron.
And I'm the other host, James Rejecsic, and today we're excited to bring on David Richard, the OG of Summon Wars graphic design, and that stands for, original graphic designer.
How you guys doing?
We're glad to have you on. David, why don't you just give a little bit of backstory about how you got into graphic design and then how you got working for Plaid Hat?
So graphic design wise, a bit of a journey. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to be when I quote unquote grew up. Initially, I went to school for video editing because I was a big movie fan. I was first introduced to Star Wars at a very, very young age. But my dad, he was actually also sort of showed me, oh, this is how the effects are made. And so I really developed an appreciation for all the behind the scenes stuff. So I really liked to sort of pick things apart visually and see how things were done. So I figured, oh, well, movie editing and that whole type of a thing seems like it'd be right up my alley to kind of get into. So started to go to school for that. As you get into these types of programs, you go to all of these sort of different basic classes, like for photography, art history, illustration, that sort of a thing. One of them had to do with graphic design and Photoshop. As soon as I got in that class, it was just a very different type of vibe. Really dug everybody, all the different classmates that I had. Then as I learned more about the program itself, Photoshop, I just fell in love. The manipulation of things, it can be used functionally, it can be used artistically. Back then it was 1994. So this is a very, very just raw version of Photoshop without all the bells and whistles that you have today. So the file sizes were much, much smaller back then in comparison. But all that to say, so then I switched my major from video editing to graphic design and visual communication. From there, I went through all those classes. One of the things I was a little concerned about, one of my teachers, they were all professionals in the industry, which is kind of awesome. But one of my teachers was letting us know, hey, you have to actually go out, talk with people and communicate with people and develop contacts. And back then I was very much an introverted type of an individual. So that sort of terrified me. I thought I could just sit behind my computer, and do all the stuff without having to, go out and make contacts with people. But one of the things that actually boosted my confidence was that very same teacher actually saw some of the work that I was doing, which I thought, back then being a perfectionist and being very kind of down on myself, she saw it as wow, that's really good. Would you like to become my studio assistant? And she'd only ever offered that position to one other individual. That was a huge boost in confidence. It also sort of got my foot in the door to really see how things operate from a professional level and just really put me out there. From there, I then was offered a job at the college that I went to school at in their kind of graphics department. They had a small print shop. We basically catered the entire campus. So that also helped boost my level of confidence because I was doing work for the science department, the English department, the math department, the nursing department, just all these different departments, which all had, their specific sort of visual look to them, things that they needed specifically. But then you also interacted with this huge, vast population of all these different individuals. So I learned how to talk to people more, which also, boosted my confidence. So that whole experience was just amazing. But then on top of that, I started to bring in sort of freelance clients. English professors would come in and be like, hey, I have this book of poetry I need laid out to be published. Is that something that you can do? It's yeah, I can do that. Hey, I have this event that I need a poster for and tickets done for. Could you do that? Yeah, I could do that. That was just awesome in and of itself. It was a whole lot of work, but it was amazing. Around that time, I was sort of getting back into board games, still playing role-playing games and whatnot, but board games itself, I'd sort of stepped away from because I wasn't anything out there that appealed to me until this one day I was looking through, I believe it was a J.C. Penney catalog, and there was this picture of this kid. This kid must have been 5, 6 years old. There was this game laid out in front of him with modular terrain and these pre-painted miniatures, and that game was Heroescape. I was what is this? And so I immediately hopped online, started looking at the game because it hadn't been released yet, but there was a website back then called heroescape.net. And it was a fan website created by this individual who actually knew the two game designers, Rob Daviau and Craig Van Ness. And so it was a forum. So I was just reading all the threads, downloading the PDF of the rules, and I was just basically addicted before the game even came out, and immediately went out, purchased the game when it was released. That website, however, was very much lacking visually. It was just very plain. It was like this desaturated pea soup green, yellow with kind of like brown fonts and whatnot. And I was like, oh, this is kind of bad. So I reached out to the guy who ran the website and I said, hey, do you mind if I try and take a crack at, making this a little bit more visually appealing for people? He was very much into it. So I did those graphics, and as payment, he was actually sending me like free HeroScape product. So I was like, this is amazing. This is so cool. From there, he actually wanted me to develop t-shirts and merch and stuff. So I did that too. But eventually he sort of like stepped away from things, mostly because Hasbro came in and sort of like shut down the website because he sort of overextended himself as far as using some copyrighted materials. So then this individual who was part of the website at the time, his name was Colby Dauk. He started up his own HeroScaper called HeroScapers.com. I immediately said, hey, do you want me to sort of like, make graphics and whatnot? And he said, yeah, that'd be so cool. So I did all that for him. Long story short, he reached out to me and he's like, hey, I'm sort of wanting to shop this game around that I've developed. I'm really sort of like hyped about it. I think it's a really cool idea, but I want it to look professional. So the whole presentation, when I, show it to these different game companies, it just looks nice and tight, and it's like a finished product that they can just, send directly to print. So that was Summoner Wars. So essentially, in order to, make his company and this presentation a little more legitimate, and that's probably going to come a little bit later, but that's basically how I was introduced to Plaid Hat Games, because back then it wasn't Plaid Hat Games. It was just Colby wanting to shop around Summoner Wars. But then eventually when, a few companies said, nah, that's not really, what we want to do, that's when he decided to take the plunge, start his own company so he could self-publish. And so that's basically at the starting point how I was introduced to Plaid Hat Games, even before it was Plaid Hat Games.
Yeah, I didn't realize that you basically helped him try to get the pitch out there, and even then people weren't biting. I remember him saying in other interviews that if he didn't get someone big to do it, he might as well do it on his own. It's kind of where he was.
He was wanting to like shop at the Fantasy Flight. That was like one of the big ones. And they said, no, because they were doing a lot of card games back then too. So I believe, if I remember correctly, that was one of the reasons why they turned him away, because, they were already putting all these games that were somewhat similar out, but didn't really have a place in their catalog at the time.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing from this story is you also had to read all of James's HeroScaper articles. And you were subject to that world also.
Oh yeah, for sure. And the HeroScape fans, a very energetic community. Back then, because it was new, everybody had their own opinions, obviously, just like everything, but still fairly friendly. It was still fairly fresh. I remember reading a lot of strategy articles, and different army builds and all that stuff. And some of it was just beyond me. Like some of it was like a science in and of itself. This life philosophy of how to take a 400-point army and just like make it perfect. It was cool, but for me, I was just like, I want dragons and robots on my army. And people would say that's not viable in the tournament scene. I'm like, I don't care. I just want dragons and robots. Admittedly, I did get pummeled whenever I went to HeroScape tournaments, but it's still pretty fun.
When he was doing that initial pitch, or you were doing the early design on the graphic design, what did he have you do in terms of like getting that to be a reality at first, how the game works?
Like I said, he said that he sort of had like a prototype. And so he had initial card layouts. He had things that, needed to be larger, such as like, the attack value. Like he wanted that to be prevalent. So when the cards were laid out on the game board, people would recognize those and be able to say, okay, this one's a more powerful unit, da 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 da. So he had something initially in mind. And he even sent me an initial layout of how he thought things should be. He also had some artwork from JJ Ariosa, who had done illustrations for Hasbro, which is how he had met JJ. Hasbro at the time was also in charge of HeroScape. So he had sort of a collection of what he wanted. Then from there, I came in and basically developed the overall visual aesthetic in a way that also complemented JJ's artwork and still evoked like the visual tonality that he was kind of looking, which was, kind of like gritty, rough, dark fantasy look to it. I basically developed like all the textures, compiled the fonts to use, and then from there I put together the Summon Wars logo, the first one with the metal and the red. I developed all the faction colors. When the first edition of the game came out, people were just like, okay, well, we appreciate the fact that the cards had, different colors specific to factions, but why didn't you add fire effects, for the Phoenix Dwarves, or like ice effects for the Tundra Orcs to really set the cards apart visually? And that was due to the fact that Colby had a very limited amount of money when he was, kind of coming at me to do this. So I was trying to develop this card template to give him the best bang for his buck, and with the understanding that there were going to be more and more factions coming out there, to sort of like make it as simplified a process as possible to take colors from a faction and integrate them in a way that the cards look specific and singular in their own right visually, without being too over the top with all these other sort of like, visual gimmicks like vines or whatnot. Basically develop like the card templates for the units, then also for like the event cards. I also did all the packaging. The initial boxes that he was shopping around were these sort of like small rectangular boxes, which were a challenge in their own right, just because of all the information that needed to be put on these tiny boxes, convey the information to the game, and also work around the illustration for the cover art that JJ had put together. I didn't develop sort of like a template, so I was like trying to make sure that things fit based on what I was given, which is sometimes difficult, if that makes sense. So I did that. I did the rule book, all the marketing materials for print and web. So basically everything Summon Wars first edition that you see back then visually, that was basically all me.
My next question was there's certain things about the game that have actually like stayed in second edition, essentially, like the fact that the cards are horizontally oriented, and also the fact that there's like about 35 cards in a deck. Is that something that had to do with the way printers work or anything like that, or like how they like the size of a deck? Is that an important?
So you're talking like in terms of like how many cards can fit on a sheet in production, right?
Yeah, like is that why the game is the size it is my question, I guess.
Personally, I don't think that was taken into account back then with first edition. And that's because if you remember correctly, the first edition cards weren't standard size cards. They were like
Yu-Gi-Oh size, yeah.
Yeah, Yu-Gi-Oh size, exactly. And people were just like, why did you make them like this? One of the reasons actually was Colby had something in mind, but I feel one of the reasons, if I remember correctly, is because the game is played sort of like on a board. But with that very first edition, the board was actually a paper sheet. It had to be folded in such a way in order to fit into these smaller boxes. So the cards had to be smaller in order for those spaces to be smaller on the board in order to make this board fit into the smaller box.
And the old one folded a lot of times.
Well, that whole paper sheet thing was sort of an interesting choice in a lot of people's minds back then. But again, because Colby had limited money production-wise, and he just wanted to get the game out there with the intent to make an actual cardstock board in a later iteration, like the first big box master set. So the card counts, I don't believe so. I think that was just his game design development as far as like how many cards were in a deck and how he sort of like played things, because back then I don't think he was as much concerned with production as he was just making sure that he got the game right and it played well. You had also asked off mic about orientation of the cards being horizontal rather than vertical, and that also kind of plays into how the game is played, how the board is set up. It's basically set between two players. Your half is on your side and the other player's half is on their side. And so if the cards were vertical, that would basically elongate the board in a way that just didn't really work well with most table sizes. You could have like rotated the player mat when you're both looking at it. Your side would be on the left, the opponent's side would be on the right. But that sort of like didn't really cater too much to like the push forward and the fall back, and defending your half of the board as you sort of like set in front of it, if it were sort of like orientated that way, if that makes sense. So that was one of the reasons why the cards were created horizontally as opposed to vertically. That too, the horizontal cards at that time, different than what most kind of like the card battle games were doing. Most of them were kind of like vertical with the art at the top, abilities on the bottom, card title at the top too. So he was also trying to break out of those norms to make Summoner Wars sort of like stand on its own visually.
So you said JJ's art came early on. Did you, like you said, work with, already have the art in hand when you were making the template for the cards to try to make it kind of work together?
Not all of the illustrations were completed, but there were a few that Colby back then was sort of like able to share with me. So I could sort of understand and see, just like the style, because the art was like kind of like very kind of like rough looking, which again sort of like leaned into the dark fantasy sort of look to it. And back then too, for the initial card templates that I developed, art for those gave me the colors to pull from to develop the colors for the factions. After that, I believe it was the first four the colors that were already chosen. So it was the Tundra Orcs,
Phoenix Elves, and
Phoenix Elves, the Cave Goblins, and the Dwarves.
the Guild Wars, yeah.
Yeah, the Guild Wars. So those ones, the colors were basically already done. But after that, I basically developed a palette of like 5 colors to then pass on to JJ based on Colby's direction for character design. JJ would then sort of incorporate the colors into those, and then I would incorporate colors into the cards based on those as well. So that was like sort of like a cool creative collaboration, kind of like working in that set.
So you got to see like a lot of the summoners' faces when you were laying out those event cards. And
oh yeah, that's another thing that people or would often sort of like say, like, well, why didn't you have like art for every single event card? Again, sort of went back to the money that was available at the time, and Colby trying to save some money. Obviously, he learned, as you can see, like in the second edition, but back then it was just something that he just had to do, unfortunately. So those whole lot of those faces up close and personal.
I do think those like colors and the accent colors really did a good job on making some of the cards pop, though. I remember I would often pick my sleeve color, not necessarily on the main color of the card, but maybe like one of those secondary colors. Like my cloaks deck, I had like a baby blue sleeves for that one, just so they would kind of like go with one of those other colors that was in there instead of the dark gray or whatever that was probably the main color. Or like I think I had gold sleeves on either Olden, or like Olden being the Guild Dwarves, or like the Sneaks, the Cave Goblins guy. I put gold sleeves on to kind of like go with it. I think it definitely had a good vibe overall, given what you guys had to work with,
Yeah, for sure. As more and more factions were released, it did become a little bit more difficult to sort of like, develop colors that still sort of like catered to the tonality of the game. But eventually it was just like, okay, well let's do like a little bit more kind of like vibrant stuff. So more pops of color to really sort of like set things off. So that was fun too, to then sort of like branch out a little bit, because you can only have so many like dark purple or dark blue type of things in there. I do admit that there are some factions that I would have gone back and said, okay, well, maybe we should make this color, or maybe switch these 2 colors out so this color isn't as prominent, because it does look a little bit too much like this. But it's just one of those things, hindsight, just like, oh, I could have done that differently. But it's not game breaking. It is something that I personally look back and say, oh, well, yeah, maybe that decision wasn't the best.
So I guess that kind of goes into the next question. Like, so how specific were your instructions generally when you were picking the colors or the symbols for the factions you worked on? Did Colby say like, hey, we want it to look like this, they got to be this way? And then what would you kind of do from there?
So color-wise, sometimes Colby had something very specific, or he had one color specific. This faction needs to be kind of like, green is going to be their primary thing, because maybe there was the swamp orc. There are going to be these green vines, so we need some like green. Just looking sort of at the theme, so it's like swamp orc. So you want like sort of like these muddy browns or like these swampy greens, just to sort of like evoke that feeling. You also want another color kind of like thrown in there sometimes, just again as an accent to kind of like make it pop. Those ones not so much, because when I was developing them, it was like swampy, so everything's kind of like murky and sort of like blended together. Phoenix Elves, they got like that yellow sort of like going on there. And that also sort of made like, their look of refinement, and gold is, because there's these princes and queens, so this is kind of like fiery royalty. I guess it kind of varied from faction to faction how things were approached. For the faction symbols, I would ask, Colby specifically, okay, so what's like their main mechanic, the character, and then the personality behind them. So I would try and, incorporate that into sort of like the look of the symbols. As an example of that, going back to the swamp orcs, the vines were very sort of like constricting. So I sort of like, made that S mark, and with like the vines sort of like all kind of like wrapped around in them. And then what was another one? The filth, with like the two snakes formed themselves into a mask, but they were sort of like biting each other. That was another one that I really enjoyed. And then the cloaks, which were sort of like, these steampunk individuals who sort of like worked in the shadows, and they're like kind of like very stealthy and elusive. So I made the gear with sort of, that the swirl sort of like in the middle. Those marks too were sometimes difficult, a bit challenging to convey these ideas because they had to be presented in a very specific way. The marks had to be single color and they had to be flat. They couldn't have like, depth or a lot of like intricate line work because they had to work in three different ways. They had to work as the metallic symbol on the back, had to work as a smaller version on the unit cards, and then they also had to work visually as the ghosted behind the text on the event cards. So you couldn't get too elaborate with them visually. Sometimes it was difficult to come up with something that, conveyed things in a way that's like, oh yeah, this is this, obviously, And sometimes like the ideas were like very abstract. I believe it was like the deep dwarves, if I remember correctly, it was like supposed to be like two mountains. The shape of the mountains kind of like delved downward. So that was like this interpretation of things, them mining into the ground. Their power was still sort of like exalted above all others. And basically sort of like what you saw on the top was actually was just like the top of it. So it's like, went in much deeper, just all these things. It was just sort of like, okay, I have this cool shape. How can I develop a story that can make this shape work for the faction? So when I presented it to Colby would just say, what the heck is this? I have the sort of like this like elaborate backstory for the logo. And he'd be like, oh yeah, that's cool. So that was kind of fun.
What was the story behind the Shadow Elves one? Do you remember that one?
Yeah. So the Shadow Elves, I just wanted something sort of like just dark and gothic. That's all it was. Dark, gothic, and interesting. And that one actually did kind of like pull over to the second edition. Some of them did. That was just basically it. Something that sort of just like conveyed, not necessarily evil, but something that just looked sharp and angular and had a sort of like dark appeal to it. And sometimes that's just what I tried to create in the faction icons, was just to give something that was interesting, to look at, just a mark that represented this faction. Didn't necessarily have a backstory, but it was just something that was cool and different from everything else.
I think you told me earlier that a few of the early faction symbols were done by JJ, like Tundra Orcs and Cave Goblins.
Tundra Orcs, Cave Goblins. He also did the Vanguards. He did the Phoenix Elves, Guild Dwarves.
So you came in at Fallen Kingdom, you said.
Yeah, at Fallen Kingdom. But then even after that, I'm pretty sure there were some that he also developed after the initial ones that he put together. So I can't say specifically like how many I had my hand in, because sometimes it was like, well, JJ can't get to this right now. Can you come up with something? So yeah, I can do that, Because I believe when he came on, the agreement was that he was going to do the faction symbols, and then I was just going to do the graphic design. But eventually it sort of like pulled away from that, especially once Colby started to take on other artists, because there was an artist by the name, I think it's Gary Simpson, who started to do some character art for the game too, to sort of lighten the load off of JJ. So like JJ would do a faction, and then Gary Simpson would do a faction. And
I think I remember him doing some of the more humanoid factions, like when they got to the Shadow Elves or some of those.
And then JJ would sort of focus more sort of like on the beast-centric factions or the monster-centric factions.
Like your Vargath and stuff like that. And I think all the dwarves and stuff, yeah.
And JJ, of course, well known for his work with the filth and making them all gross. And
Yeah, I remember when those ones came along, I was like, all right, that's cool. I was not expecting this, but I am very down with it.
So from Bistro's mind, as far as I understand it.
Yep. Bistro came with it. It's like, okay, what else is going on in that Mind Bistro?
I think some of the faction symbols that you've helped design for like the second edition are really, really cool. Like one of my favorites is the fungal dwarf one, the mushroom with the skull in it. I really like that.
And that was fun too, because going from the first edition to the second edition, leaning into the new artist style, his name is Martin Abel. He's the one that does the unit characters. He obviously has a more sort of like illustrative style. So I try and make those faction icons lean a little bit more into that, a little bit more, for lack of a better word, cartoony looking, more illustrated rather than sort of like rough and jagged, like they were in the first edition. Even some of the faction icons that I move over to second edition, I go in and sort of like refine them a little, sort of round some of the edges and make them a little bit more loose, just kind of like fit into that world, but still be recognized as the faction icon as they were shown in the first edition.
Oh, so you still did most of the ones for second edition as well?
So second edition, I've done all of the ones for second edition,
okay.
all the new stuff.
Oh, I didn't realize
Yeah.
that. For some reason, I thought that you had parted ways with Plaid Hat at some point in there, but...
Oh, no. So everything you see for second edition graphic design-wise, that's all me.
Oh, okay.
So it's been awesome to kind of like revisit that. It's been great. So like, again, all the card arts, board art, all the packaging, even like the new website that was just launched, I did all the graphic design for that. The deck boxes, everything.
Yeah, I really like the Wayfarers as a faction, but also I think their symbol's pretty cool too.
That one was awesome because I was like, how can I make this interesting? It's like, oh, I was playing around with like the compass rose symbol. Like, how could I make this interesting? And I was just sketching the little sort of like compass arrow that I made at the time. It looked like a sword. I was like, this is perfect. So I was able to sketch that out really quick. It was like, oh, yeah. So that was awesome. That's actually one of my favorites too.
Do you have, out of all the ones that you've worked on, do you have a favorite faction symbol overall? I know you like talked about how first edition you liked the cloaks and a couple of the ones you made, but is there one that sticks out more than any of the others?
That's a good question.
Not to put you on the spot, but...
I mean, I do, for the longest time, one of my favorites was the filth icon faction symbol. That was cool, just the way the snakes formed the mask. And then I got to revisit it for second edition, sort of like make it a little bit more refined. But honestly, I do think the Wayfarer symbol is one of my favorites. It just conveys that sort of like adventurous, swashbuckling theme of that faction. And it's just a very simple but cool mark. I mean, just the idea is very simple, but it's like, oh yeah, that's like pretty awesome. So I'd have to say the Wayfarers for sure.
James has often said that if there was a movie or TV show about Summoner Wars, that the Celeste, the Summoner of the Wayfarers, would probably be the main character.
Because the main reason I said that is because like it's built in that she has to travel. You know what I mean? I think, you think of all these epic stories and stuff like Lord of the Rings and all that kind of stuff. They're traveling most of the time. So I feel, or like playing RPGs, all this stuff. So I feel like Wayfarers kind of fit into that idea of who's going to be out there traveling, Like you're not going to have the Chosen Grove be the main character because they're stuck in one spot. Like, but the fact
what are we going to do, guys? Let's garden some more.
But if you have the faction that wants to go and travel the world, and I could get into the political aspects of it too, but I won't right now. But I think they have the most noble goal most of the time, which is just to kill the enemy summoner and to leave the common people protected.
Yeah. Speaking of those stories, you did see the announcement that there's going to be a comic book for Summoner.
I saw that you had a part in making that happen. I was going to ask you how that came about.
I'll try and make this as short as possible. So one of the video games that I play is called Titanfall 2. You guys might be familiar with it. It's a bit older. A game with a lot of people. And one of the individuals in my game group, his name is Justin Zimmerman, and he works for a company called BattleQuest Comics. And the more we got to talking about my role with Plaid Hat Games and just as a graphic designer for board games in general, he was like, have you guys ever have there been comic books done, for board games? I'm like, yeah, I'm there have been specifically for Plaid Hat, they did a Dead of Winter comic book. Oni Press, put out that comic book years ago. Do you think Colby might be interested in having a discussion about picking one of his titles, and making it into a comic? I mean, it might, doesn't hurt to ask. So I basically put them in touch with each other. and it's just kind of like blown up and taken off. So I want to say a couple years, 2027 is when they plan to release it. I've seen like the story and the art. It's amazing. Like Oni Press, like they did what they could, with Dead of Winter. Kudos to them. It was like a cool experience. But this is just like holy hell, this is awesome. It's like epic. Very excited for people like to actually see more from it. Hopefully eventually they'll release, just some hints of art and whatnot, but it's really cool. I won't say much more than that because I really can't, but yeah, it should be awesome.
Yeah, I know that there was some people posting in the Discord the other day because I think Martin was working on some of the art for it.
Mhm.
Not that he was talking a whole lot about it, but it was he does live streams where he just draws for the most part, and he had posted something I think on like Instagram or something that he was excited to be doing some covers again, and they were like, "Oh, it's probably for the comic books."
Maybe it is. Who's to say? No, it is. What's cool too is like I was able to be commissioned to actually take Martin's art, develop sort of like a promotional poster for it. So it's basically just all of these characters just all kind of like positioned in such a way that it looks like they're all interacting with each other. So that's also something to look forward to. So Toby was just like, oh, so I see why you introduced us. It's so you could start working in comic books. Just like, yeah, maybe it was. Maybe I did get a little bit of jobs kind of like set my way through this whole collaboration. So
Speaking of posters, I think the setting up the alliances box on first edition, that's like basically a poster in itself. Was that your work?
are you talking about the box cover? That was actually, I want to say that was JJ's
Because
work.
it looks like very graphic design put together because of the fact that like there's just a lot of different art just like pieced into this giant cover of a box.
Specifically for the alliances where they're all kind of like fighting everybody,
Yep.
each other. That was JJ's work. He kind of like put that together based on Colby's sort of direction. I'm pretty sure that was JJ. I want to say it was. Can't say for sure. It's been so long. But that wasn't me. The only thing that I did was the logo, and I did like the alliances thing underneath it, and then I just developed the rest of the box. I think I did go in and like sort of like reposition them just slightly to make sure that the title in the center was able to fit properly. But for the most part, with that design too, I provided sort of like a template of where I saw elements being placed so that then the illustrator could place important visual information confidently without it being covered up.
Nice.
So you were out there from the beginning with Summoner Wars. I mean, I was wondering, what other games did you work on as far as the graphic design for Plaid Hat? Was it Dead of Winter and some of those other ones? Or is it easier to say which games you didn't work on? I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The only two in Plaid Hat's catalog that I haven't had like a real hand in, Neon Gods and Quirky Circuits. Those were handled by Hendel, who was at the time the quote-unquote junior graphic designer, but now she is the current full-time graphic designer for Plaid Hat Games. Those are two that answer like a question or two, but it wasn't like me developing templates, providing like input, which really guided her vision. She was most likely working with Isaac Vega as he sort of like directed her graphically and visually with those. But everything else, I basically had a large hand in. Pretty big catalog considering how long Plaid Hat has been in the game. So,
Do you have a favorite game that you've done the graphic design for just based off the graphic design and then also like based off playing the game? Have you played like most of the games you've graphic designed for or
I've played all of the games that I do the design for because you just need to kind of like understand how a game works and how the different components, work together, how icons function. There are just so many things to consider. You can't really go into a game blind, especially with some of the more complex titles that Plaid Hat has sort of put together. But as far as like a specific favorite, Dead of Winter is still kind of like my all-time favorite for a number of reasons. The first reason being, as Plaid Hat was kind of like getting going, they had just launched Summoner Wars, starting to work, on Mice and Mystics. And then they brought Isaac Vega over and with this idea for this zombie game. Colby and Isaac, at the time, I was in California and they were still in Ohio. They were coming out to California to sort of like, show Dead of Winter off to a few different people. I believe they came out for a podcast. I don't remember which one it was, but then they kind of set up meetings with a bunch of different people. I remember they also came to California because they were meeting with Rocket Jump Studios, who had done Video Game High School, and they hired Plaid Hat Games to put out the board game for Video Game High School. So they were showing off sort of like a prototype for that. So they said, hey, you want to come along with us to meet a few of these people? We're going to be down in Los Angeles for a specific amount of time. And it'd be cool if you could come down. Because I'd never met Colby in person. I'd never met Isaac in person. So this was the first time seeing them in person, even though I'd sort of like been interacting with Colby for years through like, Heroescapers and then also developing Summoner Wars. We showed it off to Rocket Jump was like, they had started off as a YouTube channel and they, developed like this huge following. And then they had the Video Game High School show on Netflix. So that was like a huge thing. But I had sort of been following Rocket Jump for a while, like with Freddie Wong and, all the really fun videos that they put together. So to meet them in person was like, this is so awesome. So we went, to their studio. And then at the time, I was also a huge fan of Nerdist. They used to do like these sort of like podcast interviews with these really cool celebrities. At the time when we went to Rocket Jump Studios, there was a loft where Nerdist did like a lot of their podcasts because they had like this big giant Lego person sitting on a couch. It's like, oh my gosh, that's the thing. So I was just kind of like geeking out about all of it. And then after that, we actually went to a board game day with Rockstar Studios, the GTA people, Grand Theft Auto folks. They invited Colby to just come over and play games with, a bunch of their developers and software engineers and all this stuff. And that was awesome. Then we met with Rich Sommer, probably best known for like his role on Mad Men. He was apparently like a huge fan of Summoner Wars, and he even put out a video about Summoner Wars. That. So he's sort of like this Hollywood guy, really chill, really down to earth. He invited Colby and Isaac over there to play the Dead of Winter game. We went into his house. His house was like very just kind of chill. He had this board game room out in the back where we went. He's just like the nicest person. He's like, hey, I got like these sort of Halloween themed beers. Here's some Halloween candy. Because it was kind of like around October that we were doing this. It was so cool to see him experience, the game, just that whole interaction with board games was so awesome. It was super late. And this is how nice of a guy Richard Sommer is. He didn't know me. All he knew is like I had like about a 4.5-hour drive back to my house. He's like, hey, like you're not going to get on the road and drive back all the way back down, home, are you? I was like, no, I am. He's like, I'm just going to put it out there. You don't have to, but you can totally just like crash on the couch out here if you want to, and then just like take off in the morning. It's totally fine. I was like, that's awesome. But I had to drive back that night. But it was just the fact that he just like offered that, not even like really knowing me. That was pretty cool. So that whole thing too. But then like the fact that once I got into it, like it was always like my dream back then to do a horror themed game. Zombies. I was like big on zombies back then. So to be able to take on Dead of Winter and develop it, and then on top of that work with Fernanda Suarez, who is this amazing artist in and of itself, who later went on to basically develop every single character for first edition Ashes. She's just amazing. To develop a world with her visually, just so great. Then the fact that Dead of Winter just became like this huge success for Plaid Hat, just watching that allow Plaid Hat Games to further evolve and grow into, Colby's vision of what he wanted the company to be the whole time was just amazing. And then I also, got to create a card based on Felicia Day, who at the time doing her Geek and Sundry, they did, the special edition Dead of Winter cover. She was like a special character in there. That was cool. So much associated with Dead of Winter. And the fact that I also just like love the game. I love introducing the game to people, even still. There's just a whole lot of that. Any game that I've worked on, I do have like a certain connection with, just because going into every single title, I want it to be presented visually and functionally as best product as possible. So that means like, working with these amazing people, game designers, other artists, all these great creative collaborations that I get to be a part of is just always awesome. And that's actually one of the reasons why I appreciate being a board game graphic designer, being able to work in this industry. Growing up, I was big on RPGs, like I sort of mentioned earlier. Dungeons and Dragons 3.5 specifically, but me and my friends, we also played like TSR's Marvel, played Palladium Games, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Just flipping through those pages, there's certain like art, even like fonts in the headers, how the covers are presented. It really impacts you visually and just like adds to the memory of the experience that you have with these products, with these games, with these worlds that you're basically being transported into and how you interact with them. That impact, how it affected me as a young person to be able to, escape for a little bit into these worlds. I'm thankful to be able to have the opportunity to allow that same sense of escapism for others in a board game or a book that somebody may read, just to have like a small part to be a part of these individuals' life experiences, but are also positive life experiences. They may lose the game, that might not necessarily be a positive experience, but just the fact of being able to enjoy themselves for a little bit and face to face with other people. That board game environment can't really always have that like with a video game, when you're talking with other people over a headset or something. I went off a little bit on a tangent there, but just one of the reasons why I'm so thankful to be able to have the opportunity to have the job that I have.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned RPGs, and I want to touch on that just a second because there's been a couple of people in the community who have tossed around that Summoner Wars would make a great 5e adaptation or something of that nature, just an RPG in some sense. What do you think about that?
I think it'd be great. You see so many of sort of like 5e books kind of like pop up for everything. Like I even have one right here for Peter Pan called Neverland. And it basically just breaks down map, environments, and like, the different locations and the different races. I think it'd be great. There's definitely probably a space for it if you just have sort of like, the rules in place for 5e and you're just sort of like plugging in the information in with the Summoner Wars world. I think that'd be awesome.
I just want to play as a Storm Goblin. That's all I want,
Everybody has their dreams in life, so.
I don't know. I'd probably take a Tundra Orc or a Cave Goblin instead, or just one of the cool humans.
Vargrath would be super cool also. I think there's potential there. We'll have to convince Colby to ever take that plunge, but he seems hesitant at times. But I tell him there's a lot of people who play Dungeons and Dragons. I don't know if he knows that, but like there's quite a few people. There's like 5 or something.
It's a small localized community. Yeah, you could have like a base book for maybe like the initial set of factions, like the first 6 set of factions, but also the world of Atharia. But then you could have maybe like just like kind of smaller books for, factions as they're released and whatnot. There's so many different ways that you can approach it. I think that'd be pretty awesome.
A little monster manual without having to take down all the summoners. This guy's challenge rating 27. You gotta deal with it.
I think just the premise of like the Summoning Stone War also could lend a lot to like it obviously lends to a great narrative. I mean, there's comics coming out. There's that bunch of lore from first edition. There's lore coming in from second edition. There's a lot of narrative there, but I think just like that aspect, hey, there's these powerful artifacts that are like scattered around this world. That lends to a great narrative and a lot you could unpack there.
I just want to see a good map. I want to see a nice map.
A nice Atharia.
Yeah.
I was actually, for the relaunch of Ash's Ascendancy, I was able to make the Ash's map look nice. Apparently Bistro was like pretty excited that I had the opportunity to do that. There has been talks here and there about developing the map for Atharia. We'll see what happens, but some mumblings behind the scenes.
They have been talking about maybe doing a Summoner Wars Kickstarter in the next year or two, and they said they need more things to put into it, so we'll see what happens.
Here you go.
Besides Plaid Hat, what design opportunities have you had like outside of Plaid Hat and that aspect? Have you had like other board games you worked on or other like different adventures you've done for graphic design?
My career as a graphic designer, I've done just about everything. Like I said, I worked for a college for a while, which allowed me the opportunity to work for many different people, many different industries. And then for a year, I was actually a graphic designer for U-Haul.
Interesting.
Yeah, I was actually tasked with, they have a intercompany newsletter called the U-Haul News. And so I was in charge of the layout for that. On top of that, where I was placed with the ad department. 6 or 7 of these other individuals who at the time were developing print ads for newspapers as well as for the yellow pages. That was still a thing back then. I was then tasked with making sure that all of their work looked good. That was definitely an interesting time. I lived in Phoenix for about a year to make that happen. Everything else, kind of like done it all. I worked for a while for freelance for an independent record label, developing like, CDs, record sleeves, and that sort of a thing. Right now, my focus is board games or anything kind of like board game adjacent. And when I say like board game adjacent, one example is a company I've recently started working with called Bear Cavalry Paints. They develop kind of like a sustainably produced paints for miniature gaming. And I was actually introduced to their owner. His name is Dan. He was referred to me by Jerry Hawthorne from Plaid Hat Games. I've developed his brand from the ground up. I developed his logo. I developed all the packaging for like the bottles that his paints go into. I developed like all of the mock-ups for all of his product, convention materials like stickers, flyers, t-shirts. In a short amount of time, he's actually blown up quite a bit. He's currently, I can't specify like who, but he's talking with some larger companies for some pretty well-known games for collaboration products, paint sets and whatnot, which is awesome. So that's great. But again, miniature paints, very much kind of like, board game adjacent. And then outside of Plaid Hat Games, I've worked with many, many other companies recently and sort of like in the past with graphic design with their projects. And I'm working on about 7 projects now for board games. I'm all like really, really excited about. It's very cool to be in a position also to be able to sort of like pick and choose like, oh, that sounds fun. Or actually, I don't want to, work on that project. To be very selective about the projects that I take on, because that helps me creatively to be enthusiastic about the project that I'm working rather than kind of like go into something a bit half-hearted if I'm like, I'm not really, feeling this. Basically, everything I work on right now is board game focused.
Nice. We appreciate you coming on the podcast. Why don't you let people know where they can find you on the interwebs?
So you can find me via my website, which is pushespixels.com. I have a portfolio of my work as well as a page to contact me if you want to reach out, begin possibility of discussing your project. Social media wise, I don't do a whole lot of social media. What I do use quite a lot is Instagram, and you can find me via my username, which is Pushes Pixels. If you search Pushes Pixels, you'll see me everywhere, only because there was a point where I got that name. I tried to establish myself on every single platform with that name so nobody else could take it. For the most part, Instagram is kind of like what I use the most.
Cool.
Awesome. Once again, we appreciate you coming on the podcast and chatting with us.
Yeah, this has been fun.
This has been another Discard for Magic episode, and we'll see you guys in a couple weeks.